Cletus, I need you to come up with social distancing guidelines.
But, sir, I just cleaned the toilets here. I wouldn't know the first thing about...
Just do it! We're all busy. You're the man for the job. I'll send you an assistant to help you make notes. Good work.
Okay.
Sir, the Surgeon General just tweeted this. Seriously, people, stop buying masks. They are not effective in preventing general public from catching coronavirus. Sounds like we should mandate masks. Okay, so medical grade masks? No, just anything. An old handkerchief, a worn through t-shirt with holes in it, a maxi pad for all I care. I think these are all medical devices exquisitely designed to keep viruses out of the human body. I think.
Oh, I see nothing. I was not here. I did not even get up this morning.
After recording a little bit about the War Measures Act and some of the Canadian history, Emergency Act that we have now, I thought maybe I would look into it a little bit to make sure I was clear on how I was explaining it. And I don't have time to do all of it, but I thought maybe a follow-up video, if I have time to put this together, just explaining a little bit about how these powers are supposed to be used, what the restrictions are, and how they've been abused in the past. Bloop. Hey, look at that. There I am. All right, so War Measures Act. This is from the Canadian Encyclopedia. War Measures Act was a federal law adopted by Parliament 1914, the beginning of the First World War. And this was, of course, concerns that during a Great War, they need to be able to control things. So it was designed to take control and eliminate what we today call civil liberties. And it was used again for World War II and also in 1970 within Canada without a war by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, when there was an insurrection with the FLQ terrorists. And it was replaced in 1988 with the Emergencies Act. Okay. So, First World War, we're talking about abuses. So, if we're proud of these types of powers which Justin Trudeau has used with the Emergencies Act with the Quarantine Act, he's abused that in the same style federally, and in Canada we have provincial powers which are using their own versions of the Emergency Act, which again is ripe for abuse, and we're seeing it abused at left, right, and center. So, we have people that were declared, what's the term here? Okay, so here's a picture of an internment camp. So we have internment in World War I, different people, like different nationalities that we were concerned about.
Enemy aliens, as they were called, were forced into 24 internment camps across the country. Around 8,600 people of Austro-Hungarian descent were interned, the majority being young men, and were detained from the beginning of World War I until 2 years after the end of the war on November 11th, 1918. These camps were work camps where the prisoners were forced to build roads and clear land. These camps were strict and maintained remarkably poor living conditions.
The reality then was that the people living in those camps faced hardships that came along with being in a remote location. If you were in northern Ontario, as an example, or in the mountains of British Columbia, you were far away from medical services. Your food had to be brought in.
These camps were heavily guarded by military personnel that had either already returned from the war or were unable to serve overseas. The camps were also fortified by fencing and barbed wire.
And there was a term for them, something about alien. So what are they called? Oh, enemy aliens. So the War Measures Act rounded up Austro-Hungarian, German, and Ottoman Empire citizens or people born there. Some were Canadian born, some were naturalized British subjects. For people who don't know Canada, like Australia and India, we have a lot of ties to the UK, still even to this day. And some other ones, like people from Ukraine, had to walk around with papers and regularly report into the police. I mean, this is the type of thing, they talk about, there's a number here. So we talk about in Canada, after all of this time, 8,000 people supposedly have died from COVID. Now, these numbers are inflated. But look here. From the War Measures Act in World War I, 8,579 enemy aliens were put into internment camps. So, if you're looking for numbers that compare, abuse of power is a hell of a drug. You know, I guess that having some people die, and we're going to say that it's less than half of the 8,000 that's reported because of the way numbers have been collected. I guess it's better that for years we throw people to internment camps that don't agree with the government, because that was a power that was given by the War Measures Act in the name of holding society together during a tough time. There was anti-conscription riots. In other words, you had to serve in the military, and in particular Quebec rioted, so 6,000 soldiers were sent in there back in 1918. 150 casualties, at least 4 people died. I don't know how many died altogether. The government took control of the economy with wartime prices and trade board. And then we had this kind of stuff going on in World War II, where we essentially started having shortages of everything because they wanted to try and control prices, which is something that only an authoritarian, totalitarian government can do. So this stuff caused a lot of anger in Canada because we had a tradition of thinking of ourselves as free already at that time. And we were fighting against Nazis and shit like this. So, come the 60s, they established the Bill of Rights. Oh, yeah, War Measures Act was used to move natives off their land, and only in the 1990s did they actually get some of it back or have some kind of deal for reparations. It was just stripped from them so that they could throw up an internment camp. I wonder why the natives didn't want to give over the land. What would you like to do with this land? It was sacred to our people. Oh, we're rounding up a bunch of people that come from a certain country we're trying to kill everyone in. Do you mind if we just set up a camp and leave them there for years? Well, this may not be good with the spirits, you know. I'm thinking. Anyways, I'm not an expert on native internal politics, but I'm thinking something along those lines probably ran across their mind. So the Korean War, Charter, okay, Bill of Rights, 1960. This was the first time it was codified in Canada about human rights and fundamental freedoms, and there were exception clauses allowed, which is why in 1970, Pierre Elliott Trudeau was able to use the War Measures Act. But like I said, he used it in a very narrow way. He addressed the nation. He set out all of his criteria, which we're not seeing done in a transparent, coherent way now with the Emergency Act and the Quarantine Act. Emergencies Act. In 1988, the War Measures Act was repealed and replaced by the Emergencies Act. And this had a lot to do with the fact that 22,000 Japanese on the West Coast were rounded up and put into internment camps. And that's not including the other people that were rounded up. But by far, that was the largest group in the Second World War. They had, just like in the First World War, they had their stuff taken away and not given back. And they were paid way below regular wages for the forced labor they were forced to do on all kinds of hard projects.
In March 1941, Japanese Canadians were required to register and carry cards with their photo and thumbprint. Their fishing boats were seized and their schools closed. After the December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, life for the Japanese in Canada became even more difficult.
A year later, March 4th, 1942, the BC Security Commission was put in place to start evacuating Japanese so that there were no Japanese within 100 miles of the BC coast.
Families were given 24 to 48 hours to leave their homes and then sent to temporary detainment centers such as Hastings Park, now the PNE, where they were held until the men were sent to work camps and the women and children to internment camps in remote areas such as New Denver, Caslow, Slocan City, and more. Many of their possessions, homes and cars, were sold without their knowledge or permission. At the Tejmi camp near Hope, they had to buy their food at the BC Security Commission-run store using special coupons. The Japanese Red Cross sent care packages to Japanese interned in Canada. Not until 1949 were the restrictions removed. It was 4 years after Japan surrendered and the war ended that evacuated Japanese Canadians could return to the coast. Many never did, making a new life elsewhere in Canada.
So it really was internment. And this was under the same act that gave birth to today's Emergency Act. So just a quick breakdown. I figured I'd say, let's do some adjusting for population. The amount of people that were rounded up at those times and put into internment camps under what was emergency powers of those times to today. So adjusting for population. We've got the 1914. And in millions, we had a total population in Canada of 7.9, approximately 7.9 million. And then in 2020, we now have approximately 37.6 million. So the difference there, or the factor of the difference for the population that's increased, is a factor that's increased by 4.76 times. All right, so that factor, 4.76, and you take the interned people total in World War I, which is believed to be 8,579, so 8,579 people. You multiply that, and what comes out at the end is the total that would have been today. So it would have been, if in 2020, it would have been over 40,000, almost 41,000 people rounded up based on an arbitrary thing that was believed to be scary at the time, that today we see as a gross crime against humanity that we're ashamed of. People's ethnicity, right? Okay, so we take that 40,000, 41,000, that number in total. Let's just give a little comparison to give perspective. Today, the city I have grown up in it's a city and has never reached that amount. It today is at 38,909. All right, my entire city that I have known, everyone in it would be in an internment camp that size plus some. Okay, let's move on. Let's adjust for population of World War II. In 1939, our population was approximately 11.3 million in Canada. In 2020, as I have said before, we got 37.6 million. The factor of the difference is 3.33. So it sounds like less so far, right? That factor of 3.33 and a total interned people in World War II, mostly Japanese, but not all, was about 24,000 altogether. So you multiply 3.33 and 24,000, and what are you going to get? If in 2020, you're going to get 79,920. 79,920 in today's population equivalent. So we'll say 80,000. 80,000 people in internment camps, rounded up because of their ethnicity, for safety and security. This is always the championing cause. Everything that is told to the population that should scare us justifies the crimes against individual liberties, the crimes against humanity of the time, under emergency powers. So 80,000 people in an internment camp then, and I'm giving some numbers here, the military, total military, that's full-time military, and the people who are on reserves in Canada come out to about 42,000. So almost twice our military today would be in numbers in internment camps. Okay, so let's give a different one. 80,000 people in internment camps. The total number of all types of police officers in any type of police unit in Canada is 68,500. It is still far more than the number of police officers in the country. So this is just to give a perspective. I haven't even calculated the amount of people that had to carry papers and report in arbitrarily, mostly Ukrainians. I think in World War I, over 80,000 treated like they were hostile, this term of enemy alien. Well, the same thing can happen with all kinds of criteria. As long as it frightens you, as long as the government can get you scared, they can get you to turn a blind eye as things get worse and worse and more grievous crimes against humanity are committed. So don't tell me it's a conspiracy theory that COVID and people who don't comply won't get rounded up, won't be removed from the regular, everyday rights in a free society that we've enjoyed up till now. Change happens. Are we going to allow the change to happen? Here are some numbers. I hope you consider them. And so we look at, in specific here, okay, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights. These are the two things within our Constitution that are supposed to prevent government overreach and trampling on our independence as an individual in this country. And that is something specifically that Trudeau Sr. said when he invoked the War Measures Act, was that terrorists are people who are trying to overthrow the duly elected government rather than using the democratic measures at hand to change it, right? So he's separating the government that is duly elected and is upholding the Constitution from a government which is authoritarian and oppressing the people.
I am speaking to you at a moment of grave crisis, when violent and fanatical men are attempting to destroy the unity and the freedom of Canada. One aspect of that crisis is the threat which has been made on the lives of 2 innocent men. These are matters of the utmost gravity, and I want to tell you what the government is doing to deal with them. What has taken place in Montreal in the past 2 weeks is not unprecedented. It has happened elsewhere in the world on several recent occasions. It could happen elsewhere within Canada. But Canadians have always assumed that it could not happen here, and as a result we are doubly shocked that it has. Our assumption may have been naive, but it was understandable. Understandable because democracy flourishes in Canada. Understandable because individual liberty is cherished in Canada. Notwithstanding these conditions, partly because of them, it has now been demonstrated to us by a few misguided persons just how fragile a democratic society can be if democracy is not prepared to defend itself, and just how vulnerable to blackmail are tolerant, compassionate people. Should the governments give in to this crude blackmail, we would be facing the breakdown of the legal system and its replacement by the law of the jungle. The government's decision to prevent this from happening is not taken just to defend an important principle. It is taken to protect the lives of Canadians from dangers of the sort I have mentioned. Freedom and personal security are safeguarded by laws. Those laws must be respected in order to be effective. Let me turn now to the broader implications of the threat represented by the FLQ and similar organizations. If a democratic society is to continue to exist, it must be able to root out the cancer of an armed revolutionary movement that is bent on destroying the very basis of our freedoms. For that reason, the government, following an analysis of the facts, including the requests of the government of Quebec and of the City of Montreal for urgent action, decided to proclaim the War Measures Act. It did so at 4 a.m. this morning in order to permit the full weight of government to be brought quickly to bear on all those persons advocating or practicing violence as a means of achieving political ends. The War Measures Act gives sweeping powers to the government. It also suspends the operation of the Canadian Bill of Rights. I can assure you that the government is most reluctant to seek such powers, and did so only when it became crystal clear that the situation could not be controlled unless some extraordinary assistance was made available on an urgent basis. The authority contained in the Act will permit governments to deal effectively with the nebulous yet dangerous challenge to society represented by terrorist organizations. The criminal law as it stands is simply not adequate to deal with systematic terrorism. The police have therefore been given certain extraordinary powers necessary for the effective detection and elimination of conspiratorial organizations which advocate the use of violence. These organizations and membership in them have been declared illegal. The powers include the right to search and arrest without warrant, to detain suspected persons without the necessity of laying specific charges immediately, and to detain persons without bail. These are strong powers. and I find them as distasteful as I am sure you do. They are necessary, however, to permit the police to deal with persons who advocate or promote the violent overthrow of our democratic system. In short, I assure you that the government recognizes its grave responsibilities in interfering in certain cases with civil liberties, and that it remains answerable to the people of Canada for its actions. The government will revoke this proclamation as soon as possible.
Because that was not happening, and people were becoming terrorists in small numbers, as it turns out, in Quebec, an insurrection was afoot. He called out the military to help quell it and try to recover a still, as far as they knew, alive British diplomat who, after the labor minister of Quebec had been kidnapped and murdered by the FLQ. So, and he specifically said in his address to the nation, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, that we are a nation of democratic tradition and the rights of the individual's liberties. This is where he is 180 degrees separate and different from his son, who is now our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. So, all right, so I'm going on here. Let's click on this Emergency Act, get a little detail on here. Now, I'm doing this all on my phone. We'll have some downtime. I hope you find this interesting. Okay, so what I didn't tell you about the War Measures Act is I was a little incorrect. I was correct and incorrect in the way I expressed it. So you had three criteria, and a state of emergency was not one of the criteria specifically. They all kind of are state of emergencies. You have threats against your country that you cannot deal with in a normal way from outside of your nation. So this would be perhaps a threat of nuclear annihilation, perhaps, something like that. An invasion from outside the country. So most people would say these are the same, but at the time they saw them as separate, I guess. And then the third one would be an insurrection that you had to prove before enacting the act. Like, this is actually happening. Here's the evidence. And he did all of that for that. He laid out his criteria and he limited the use and the infringements. But now, under the Emergencies Act, we have 5 different types. National emergencies, public welfare emergencies, public order emergencies, international emergencies, and war emergencies. So, I'm not going to go through all of them. Let's just say that these powers can be called up by any government. They are so flimsy and they are so expansive, and the words can be so easily manipulated because it was written in 88. And it seems like as we go through time, our politicians become more foolish and incompetent even in the way they frame our legislation. So this stuff is ripe for abuse. You can really justify at any time an emergency of this nature, of something that, you say might happen, but you have no evidence that it is. But I'll lay this out specifically with the category that we are in. The Act defines a public welfare emergency as one that is caused by a real or imminent A, fire, flood, drought, storm, earthquake, or other natural phenomenon. B, disease in human beings, animals, or plants. So B is the one we're looking for. C would be accident or pollution, and that results or may result in a danger to life or property, social disruption, or a breakdown in the flow of essential goods, services, or resources so serious as to be a national emergency. So they would say we have COVID, and they are going to ignore the part that they caused the problem by not shutting down transportation and enacting quarantines at the border crossings and ports of entry. They're going to ignore all of that and say, oh, it's just a disease out of nowhere. So the government needs to solve the problem, even though they've caused the problem.
Well, I understand that there's some voices that would say that we should shut down the border to China. But I would say that Canada is following expert advice from the World Health Organization and working closely with allied partners like France and the UK and Germany, who have decided to take a different approach than the approach that the Australians and Americans have taken for a whole bunch of reasons. First being that it's much easier to support people from a region that's experienced such an outbreak if we know where they're coming from. And the evidence says that when you shut down a border like that, it gets much harder to actually detect where people are coming from because people are determined to get into a country or return home, and they will find alternative routes to do so. Secondly, the long-term implications of shutting down borders is one, they're not very effective in controlling disease, as in fact, they're not effective at all. And secondly, they actually long-term can create a greater risk to global public health. And here's why. China has been very open. Now, some will say, were they open enough and how fast were they open? But what we know is that within a week or so, they were letting the World Health Organization and therefore all of the partner countries know that they had an outbreak on their hands.
Within a week or so.
But I would say that Canada is following expert advice from the World Health Organization.
We will be discussing that because, look, many people in my own family have come through airports in recent days. They have seen no screening, nothing but voluntary suggestions saying things like if you've come from Iran or Italy or China, which is now out-of-date information. Why is there no mandatory screening at airports? Why is there no mandatory even spacing/social distancing at airports? Shouldn't that happen?
One of the things we're very mindful of is we do not want public health officials to be using up their time and resources at airports doing something that isn't the most impactful thing they can be doing.
Let me be clear. There is no place in our country for discrimination driven by fear or misinformation.
And here is what they need to lay out. If a public welfare emergency is declared, the federal government is required to specify A, the state of affairs constituting the emergency. So this means you must define specifically what it is. Okay? So we are talking about a disease that when they enacted their powers, the Quarantine Act and the provinces, the Emergency Act, they did not really understand a lot about this illness. So they could not actually specify the state of affairs constituting the emergency. B, the special temporary measures that the governor in council anticipates may be necessary for dealing with the emergency. So this means your point man in the government who's going to be taking action and laying out rules for everyone. What do they anticipate they're going to need to do to deal with this emergency? And once again, this continually changes, often on a daily basis. First, it was, some businesses should shut down for a while, and some people should stay home. Then it was, social distance, stay away from each other. But no one should be wearing masks. And then it became, that's not going to be 2 weeks. It's going to be 2 months. And then it's going to be 4 months. It's going to be 5 months. It's going to be 2 years. And so now we need face masks. And, you got to clean down surfaces. It turns out we don't need to clean down surfaces. It is chaos, and is government born, this chaos. They have created it because they have acted before they could do A or B in what they need to specify. And then C, the area of Canada to which the direct effects of the emergency extend. So, listen to the language. The area of Canada, not Canada as an area, the area of Canada to which the direct effects of the emergency extend. Emergency extend. This language is very clear. Its intentions and its meaning is obvious. You can't do this for all of Canada. Just saying everywhere in Canada, we're going to do whatever we need to do because we're not really sure what's going on. Like, these are not the criteria of a coherent, emergency response, let alone one that undermines your constitution and shuts it down. And quite frankly, I am not that concerned as to whether it's incompetence or maliciousness, other than the fact that maliciousness comes with connections to China and other foreign players who have never appreciated the liberties that we have here or our close relationship with the UK and with America. I am sick and tired of hearing people telling us how to live our lives. I have to wear a mask at times at work, but if I don't wear one at work, then my company could get into trouble. They could lose their license to operate as a business, which has happened previously during the lockdown to companies. So this is not goodwill. This is not free will. This is not constitutional. This is an illegal attack en masse on our rights. And I think that whether it's intentional, planned out or not, it will be the staging area for stripping us permanently of our rights if they see that we aren't willing to stand up for ourselves, to stand together, that our freedoms are meaningful enough to us that we're willing to push back against the government and take a risk.
We just need to continue to remind Canadians, and the media is doing a great job of that, of going to the sources where there is credible information. I think there was a very illuminating comment today that sometimes there are alternative agendas for misinformation. People sometimes drive fear because they like to. Sometimes they drive fear because it might result in a profit. You can sell more masks, for example, if you create more fear. People sometimes drive fear as a way to cast aspersions on communities. And we've seen all of that in different contexts.
Agendas for misinformation. Agendas for misinformation. Agendas for misinformation.
In order to ensure the security and continuing stability, the Republic will be reorganized into the first galactic empire for a safe and secure society.
This is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause.